7,500, and there are more than 190,000 cases. I'm going to bring you up to date on the situation in a number of countries over the next few minutes. These are some of the most recent pictures to come in. This is from Barcelona, where people have been out on their balconies playing instruments, sometimes alongside each other. You can see a young guy there playing the saxophone. This is inside a rest home in Japan, where people have been exercising indoors because they're not allowed to go outside. And remember, the virus is particularly deadly for elderly people. And remember, Japan has the most elderly population in the world, so particular care is being taken. These people are exercising outside on their rooftops in Rome, doing it in part in coordination with other neighbours across the way. You can see most of them still staying a little distance apart. Not so active in Venice, but these police are out on the streets to make sure quarantine regulations are being observed. Bear in mind, across Italy, people can only leave their homes if they have an urgent work reason or they need to get some food. And we're going to focus a little more on Italy now, because more than 2,500 people have died there and there are over 30,000 cases. It's the worst affected country aside from China. And as we've been discussing over the last month, the north of Italy is really the centre of this outbreak. Well, the New York Times The Daily podcast has spoken to a doctor in Bergamo. This is Professor Fabiano Di Marco. He's head of a respiratory unit there. He says doctors are making life and death decisions. They're admitting up to 70 critically ill patients a day, and that some patients are dying alone because the staff are overwhelmed. Inevitably, some of those staff are also becoming ill. Here's more of what he told the New York Times.
If I allow one or two relatives to come to the hospital, I have to give them these, but we do not have this for us.
Right, you need them for doctors.
Yeah. They cannot receive the relative in hospital. So the patients are alone and they die alone.
Well, this evening, EU leaders, including Italy's Prime Minister, have agreed to close Europe's borders for 30 days. They are establishing some fast-track lanes to allow goods to come between countries. Even so, this is just an additional measure on top of strident restrictions already. Bear in mind, Italy has been under a complete lockdown for close to a week now. Sima Katechas in Rome.
A display of resilience and solidarity. Locals in Rome feeling optimistic about what lies ahead as the country tackles the worst health crisis in a generation.
How do you feel the government is doing?
Sorry?
The Prime Minister, do you agree with what is happening?
Yes, I do.
Why?
Because it's the right thing to do, I think.
I never see Rome in this situation.
Popular streets empty, no tourists, nothing open. Orlando is a taxi driver. He tells us the soul has been ripped out of Italy.
I am not busy because there aren't people. Only to the hospital, some tourists, but very, very down.
The country has enforced rules preventing people from moving around. Stay indoors, especially if you're older, they're told. But some are choosing to rebel.
The advice for people who are older is to stay indoors?
Yes, we know. No, because we think we have to walk a little bit. Every 2 days we take a walk.
Well, let's hear a little more about how daily life has changed in Rome. Here's another resident of the city.
We feel a bit more lonely. We feel a little bit more segregated. We feel a little more bored than we used to. So I think we kind of changed our daily life, and I really hope that will help us to understand that maybe we needed to slow down a little bit.
Well, from Europe to the US, there are now nearly 6,000 cases there, and the death toll has reached 100. This map's been released by the primary US government body on this issue, the CDC, and it shows us that there's only one state, West Virginia, which has no reported cases. And also the CDC continues to push messages that are now very familiar. It says avoid close contact with people who are sick, wash your hands often, avoid touching your face, nose and eyes. And while the CDC plays its role in this health emergency, Today, Donald Trump turned to the strain on the US economy, just as Boris Johnson did here in the UK. And President Trump unveiled a raft of measures, including payments to small businesses, loan guarantees, and deferred personal tax payments. Here's a little of the statement from earlier.
We want to go big, go solid. The country is very strong. We've never been so strong, and that's what we're going to be doing. We don't want, with this invisible enemy, we don't want airlines going out of business. We don't want people losing their jobs or not having money to live when they were doing very well just 4 weeks ago. So we're going big, and that's the way it'll be, and that's the way everybody seems to like it on the Hill.
Well, let's bring in Gary O'Donoghue, who's live with us from the US. Gary, the president's saying everyone likes it this way on the Hill. Is that true? Has it got bipartisan support?
Well, the tone has changed on the Hill. There's no question about that, Ros. There's much more sort of bipartisan talk going on up there. They're not yelling at one another, frankly, as they normally are. And what's going to happen is that there's a bill going through at the moment that's worth a sort of $100 billion in help. But there's a much bigger one being talked about. And Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader up there, he set up a group of task forces to look at different areas of the economy, like individuals on the one hand, the airline industry on the other, small business on the other. They're going to draw something up and then try and knock out a deal with their Democratic counterparts. By the time all this has piled up, you could be looking at somewhere in the region of $1 trillion, $1,000 billion bailout situation.
And Gary, just quickly before we go on to another issue, I think a lot of people are wondering how quickly can this be turned round? How quickly can money actually reach people?
Well, the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, today says he wants checks, literally checks, to go out to Americans within the next 2 weeks. Now, that won't be all Americans. He doesn't want to give them to millionaires, as people will argue is pretty fair. But it might be people on maybe $75,000 or less, or $100,000 or less. And you're looking at a handout of maybe $1,000. All this detail is to be hammered out. And that seems to be the preferred system of help that the Trump administration wants to use, rather than doing anything with payroll taxes, which you wouldn't see for months and months and months.
So, Gary, that's the first story I want to ask you about. Here's the second, because there is now increasing tension between China and the US in the middle of this crisis. Today, Beijing announced that all US journalists working for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post are going to be expelled. They've got just 10 days to leave. And this looks like a direct response to this tweet yesterday from Donald Trump, in which he referred to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. Now, of course, it isn't a Chinese virus. It's a virus that started in China. And the president will surely have expected a response. Bear in mind, back in February,